So, we are going to COP this year. I think all of us are very well aware of the geopolitics in the time we are in. 2 years of COVID and now the Ukraine war, the Russian-Ukraine war. We are going to COP at a time when the countries, the most industrialized countries, the countries who are responsible for emissions in the atmosphere, the countries that have to take deep, drastic emission reduction are now struggling to deal with high fuel prices, are looking at gas once again, are looking at reinvestment in fossil fuel. They say this is going to be temporary, but the fact is this is a huge setback. And we know very clearly that we are not on track to reduce emissions at the scale and pace needed, that this is an absolute crisis as the world goes to COP. Mitigation is not happening at the scale and pace that is needed. But then there is the other part of it, that we are also going to COP at a time when the world is really blowing up, when you're beginning to see the revenge of nature, you're beginning to see extreme weather events happening, which are devastating the world, the rich, but mostly it is the poor who are worst hit. And what we have to remember is that this scale of devastation is happening when temperatures are only 1.1 degrees centigrade increase over the pre-industrial era of 1870. And we know that we are on track to breach the 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. So it's going to get much worse. The IPCC this year, and just to quickly reiterate what IPCC put down on the table, that's what we need to remember as we get to COP. One, that we have a very small window to reverse the damage. Two, that the impacts are devastating, that half the world's population is highly vulnerable, that the poor are worst hit. For the first time, the IPCC report acknowledged the need for equity and climate justice. First time after 3 decades of climate discussions. And this is because the imperative of equity, the fact that large numbers of developing countries who are victims of climate change, their voices need to be recognized. Their space for development needs to be recognized. And lastly, for the first time, IPCC report talked about climate change related displacement, that people are being forced out of their villages and home because of repeated extreme variable weather. And we know that this increases the insecurity in our world. Migration is the hottest political topic across the world. 2 days ago, and we are exhausted, and I'm sure all of you who have been joining us are equally exhausted. 2 days ago, we released the India 2022 report, where my colleagues tracked 9 months of the year, and they essentially gave you a solid database to show you that we have one disaster a day over these 9 months, and that these disasters have been lightning, storms, flood, heat wave, cold wave, landslides. You really are seeing the revenge of nature, as I keep saying. When I say one disaster a day, it does not have any data from Bihar, because there is no data from Bihar. So if you look at these 4 maps of India, East India, Central India, South India, and Northwest India, somebody remarked yesterday, in fact, where is Bihar? But the Bihar government has not put any data out to the disaster management division of the Ministry of Home Affairs. So we have no data. So if you look at it, it's definitely worse. And this is the watermark of climate change, because we know that climate change is not about a single event, but it's about increased frequency of events. And each region of the world is hit. We've heard about Pakistan floods, Nigerian floods. Yesterday, we had extreme rainfall in Chennai. This is breaking the backs of the poorest who are worst impacted. They are losing their capacity to cope with these repeated and frequent events. This is why loss and damage is so centrally on the agenda at COP27. Now, the one thing that we have to remember as we get to COP, because the Paris rule book, so the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015, essentially shifted the global politics on climate. The 1992 Agreement on Climate Change, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, essentially agreed upon the fact that there are two sets of countries which have created the problem, the countries that we are showing you here in this chart in orange, and the countries who need their right to development to grow. However, in Paris, it has been the principle of historical emissions has been erased, and everybody has to take emission reduction now. The problem with that is this pie chart. But I just want to make the central point that if you take this data here on the percentage share of CO2, global CO2 emissions by country, the position becomes very stark. Those industrialized countries that contributed to the problem in 1992 remain the largest occupier, appropriator of the global carbon budget. The only country that has now made its way into that club in any respectable form is China. China is yesterday's United States. And by 2030, it will be equating its share of the global emissions with United States. That's an important issue as we get to Sharm el-Sheikh. India's share remains at 4.25%, even at, we take the NDC into account, but even with that, we are hardly occupying any of the carbon space that should be something that is our due. But then look at African continent, look at the rest of the 70% of the world population, including India. They have nothing, which is why we need to make sure that when the world discusses loss and damage, it is really about payment for compensation, reparation, and it is the liability of polluters. So mitigation is clearly still on the table, has to be on the table. We're off track. The new NDCs have been submitted. The question is, will this now lead, because we are off track, the UNEP report on the emissions gap has said so, every other report is saying so. Will it lead to more pressure on the developed world? Will it lead to pressure on China, or will it lead to pressure on countries like India? And this is where the global stocktake, which is now part of the Paris Agreement, but will come up in 2023, that discussion is crucial, because that discussion is really about being able to look at the responsibility of countries from the point of view of their contribution and the need for them to take even more drastic emission reduction. Issue of funding is going to come up, and also the fact that we need to discuss debt relief. The adaptation goal has been one of talk, technical talk, scientists trying to understand what is adaptation, what are communities, but the fact is there is hardly any money. Loss and damage. It's the biggest issue for this COP. It's a biggest issue because of what I started off with saying. The impacts of climate change are known today. Countries like Vanuatu are putting this firmly on the table, saying, we want to be compensated for the losses that we are suffering. The question will be, will this firstly happen? Will there be funding attached to it? And most importantly, will it come based on a principle of liability and compensation, or will it just be coached and framed within another fund of charity and some more money? And therefore, the question becomes, will it dip into the money from the development assistance that governments already give? There are other issues of how will we actually combat climate change, where the whole issue of a new market instrument will be discussed. The issue is, will it become a transformational rules, or will there be rules which are like CDM, cheap rules for the rich countries to buy cheap emission reductions in the poorer countries? Same issues are coming up with nature-based solutions, forests, but whose? And there are very major questions today on the issue of nature-based solution and how does it actually affect and maybe go contrary to the goals that the world is setting for biodiversity conservation. So those are some of the big issues. Thank you, Anumita.